The Rules Committee will come to order. Sorry we had a little technical difficulty at the outset there. We're here for consideration of H.R. 4078, the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act of 2012. We're happy to welcome the Chair and Ranking Member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and we have representing the Committee on the Judiciary, Mr. Griffin. He has to go downstairs. And then we'll proceed to the other committees. So, Mr. Issa, thank you very much for being here. Without objection, a prepared statement that you have will appear in the record in its entirety, and we welcome your summary.
Thank you, and I'll be brief. H.R. 4078, the Red Tape Reduction and Small Business Job Creation Act, is in fact the combination of the efforts of our committees and others. It represents at least 7 different necessary changes. Some of these are, in fact, bipartisan and non-controversial. All of them should be bipartisan and non-controversial. Some of the areas that are critical, for the last 18 months, the committee has asked job creator, ultimately the experts of how to create jobs in the private sector, to tell us about regulations that hinder job creation. They've gone to the AmericanJobCreator.com website, and they've given us direct input. We've also issued 3 reports, held 11 full committee hearings, and nearly 30 subcommittee hearings. This has led us to believe a number of these pieces of legislation, some not originating from our committee, are necessary if we're going to get America knowing the certainty necessary to work again. President Obama's Chief Regulatory Officer, Cass Sunstein, praised the committee's work on regulations as constructive and important. Our chief finding is that federal bureaucrats are, in fact, running amok, not because they're ordered to, but because ultimately it is an opportunity that they have seized. Particular importance is, in fact, not the number of regulations, but the dollar size of the largest regulations. Ultimately, at the center of this act is, in fact, a new set of guidelines. Some would call, and we do like to call it, a moratorium, but it's only a partial slowing down of regulations that cost over $100 million. The act allows the President, for all the necessary and essential reasons, to, in fact, have any number of major bills, major regulations that would cost over $100 million. But it requires the President act that these are essential and necessary at this time for national security, for civil rights, for health and safety. We passed the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, H.R. 373, which will help prevent excess and unfunded regulatory mandates, and it's being imposed on state and local governments. So, of course, it has a ripple effect beyond its original scoring. We've also passed H.R. 4078, which puts a temporary hold on the most burdensome regulations until unemployment reaches 6%. And that's the one that I think, as the Rules Committee looks, you'll realize it has all the necessary exceptions to ensure that for purposes of America's safety, confidence, and, in fact, other constitutional requirements, rules will still be made. The difference is the President will look at each of these major rules in order to grant the exception. We think that that's essential. When something costs over $100 million, and often over many billions of dollars, it's essential that it rise to the Chief Executive before becoming a rule. I thank the Rules Committee.
I also will be very brief. And Chairman Dreyer and Ranking Member Slaughter and the members of the Rules Committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify here on H.R. 4078, the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act of 2012, a legislation that would produce terrible results for the American people. H.R. 4078 is based on the false premise that business investment and hiring is being held back by uncertainty over future regulations. The bill disregards evidence from economists on both sides of the political spectrum, as well as businessmen and women themselves, who all agree that regulations do not negatively impact the economy or job growth. In fact, there's substantial evidence that the very opposite is true. As Cass Sunstein stated at an Oversight Committee hearing last September, a moratorium would not be a scalpel or machete. It would be more like a nuclear bomb in the sense that it would prevent regulations that cost very little and have very significant economic or public health benefits. The bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, is that regulations save lives, protect the health and safety of hundreds of millions of Americans, and provide protections that are critical to the functioning of a healthy economy. H.R. 4078 is a direct attack on the regulatory system that helps ensure the health and welfare of the American people is protected. A balanced view and a review of regulations that updates and streamlines them, similar to the review the Office of Management and Budget is currently conducting, balances costs and benefits, but does not sacrifice core protections for the health and safety of the American people. It is entirely appropriate. Mr. Chairman, I submitted 2 amendments to the committee for consideration that seek to highlight just how devastating this legislation could be to children and seniors, the most vulnerable populations in our society who are most in need of regulatory protections. One amendment would exempt regulations impacting the health and safety of children from the regulatory freeze imposed by this legislation. Just one example of a pending regulation that would be halted by the bill is FDA's rule to ensure that infant formula is safe by requiring manufacturers to use safe practices. The other amendment would exempt any regulation needed to implement the Medicare program. The CBO found that this bill would freeze routine Medicare provider rate adjustments. Medicare providers would not receive updates to their pay rates, which ensure that the Medicare payments keep pace with inflation. This could lead to a loss of jobs at hospitals and other healthcare facilities, and in turn hurt seniors in need of care. I would urge the committee to adopt an open rule for H.R. 4078. If the committee instead chooses to adopt a structured rule, I would ask that both my amendments be made in order. I would also urge the committee to make as many amendments in order as possible to allow members to adequately debate both the intended and unintended consequences of this bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cummings. Appreciate that. I'm told that Mr. Johnson is leading the charge for the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee, so if you'd like to come to the table and join Mr. Griffin, we'd appreciate that. You can pull the chair right next to Mr. Watt there. Pull up right next to Mr. Griffin. These guys can just slide over a little here. And Mr. Griffin, let me say again, as I did at the outset, that any prepared statement that you all have will appear in the record in its entirety. We have lots of witnesses, so any of you would like to summarize briefly, it would be greatly appreciated. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am happy to put my statement into the record, but I would like to make just a few comments, if I could, and I will keep this brief. First and foremost, I don't know anyone that is against reasonable regulations, Mr. Chairman. What we are talking about dealing with the freeze bill are excessive and overly burdensome regulations. And if there is any question as to the impact of regulations on jobs, I just like to bring your attention to The Economist cover story, Over-Regulated America, not hardly a right-wing publication. The article states that the home of laissez-faire is being suffocated by excessive and badly written regulations. I would also point out that President Obama has indicated that he agrees that these regulations, overly burdensome ones, impact job creation. President Obama last year indicated that rules have, quote, gotten out of balance, placing unreasonable burdens on business, burdens that have stifled innovation and have had a chilling effect on growth and jobs, end quote. So it sounds like we agree on the problem. I would also say that in this legislation there are ample exceptions and exemptions. In fact, there is a broad overall a waiver or exception that allows the President to seek approval from the Congress, much like the REINS Act, for the sort of regulations that my colleague just cited involving Medicare, children's formula, etc. I have a 2-year-old, baby John Jr., and he still takes a bottle at night, and he uses formula. And I want that formula to be safe, and I absolutely would approve those regulations when brought to the Congress by the President. So the idea that that sort of nonsense that has to be stopped because of this is nonsense. There's ample ability to regulate in this bill as needed, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to appear today regarding H.R. 4078, the Red Tape Reduction and Small Business Job Creation Act. Today, my comments are being made on behalf of Representative John Conyers, the ranking member of the Committee on Judiciary. Our nation faces many significant challenges, including unemployment, crushing student loan debt, and the ongoing home foreclosure crisis. Rather than addressing any one of these critical issues, the Judiciary Committee instead held 14 hearings and marked up 6 bills that aim to stifle federal agencies from issuing rules that ensure the safety of the water we drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the cars we drive, and even the planes that we fly, and baby John's toys would be protected. H.R. 4078 represents the culmination of all of these ill-conceived efforts, and if enacted, would jeopardize public health and safety and undermine our nation's economic well-being. The argument made repeatedly by the sponsors of this legislation is that regulations somehow depress job creation. H.R. 4078 even goes so far as to link regulations with the nation's unemployment rate as a ploy to stop agencies from issuing significant regulatory actions. Let me explain why 4078 represents the ultimate in legislative foolishness. To begin with, Mr. Chairman, H.R. 4078, by stopping or delaying rules going into effect, seriously jeopardizes the safety and soundness of our nation's economy and society generally. Another fundamental problem with this legislation is that it myopically focuses on the cost of regulations while largely ignoring their overwhelming benefits to the health and safety of Americans. The proponents of this legislation clearly prioritize a short-sighted anti-regulatory agenda favored by certain business interests over the public's interest. This was demonstrated over the course of those 14 hearings before the Judiciary Committee. Not a single majority witness who testified in support of an anti-regulatory agenda represented a consumer perspective. H.R. 4078, notwithstanding its misleading short title, will not result in creating jobs for one simple reason. There is absolutely no credible evidence establishing that regulations have any substantive impact on job creation. In sum, H.R. 4078 is a fundamentally flawed bill, and I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose it. Now, I've had the privilege of reading Ranking Member Conyers' remarks into the record, and in addition, I have submitted 5 amendments to this committee on this flawed bill. One of my amendments, and should I roll with those right now?
The floor is yours.
Okay, I'll roll with it right now. One of my amendments would prevent regulations that actually create jobs from being held up in a chokehold. Another amendment would ensure that all regulations promulgated under the Constitutional Affordable Care Act would be able to move forward. There's also a provision in this bill that attempts to skirt around the environmental review process for construction projects, and one of my amendments would only allow the bill to apply to projects that the Council on Environmental Quality determines does not have a detrimental impact on human health. In addition, I've submitted 2 amendments to ensure that consent decrees and settlement agreements pertaining to child safety and the Affordable Care Act are not held hostage under this bill. I ask the committee to make these amendments in order, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Appreciate it. Let me thank the 4 of you for being here. Let me just explain. We have lots of witnesses. 2 other committees share jurisdiction of this, both the Financial Services Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. What we want to do is go through and see if members have questions for the 4 of you, and then we're going to move from there to Messrs. Manzullo and Frank and Hastings and Markey. And so, let me see. Any questions, Mr. Sessions? No, sir. Okay. Ms. Slaughter?
Chair. I want to just speak on one issue that's in this bill because it really was very startling to me. I didn't know it until this morning. We passed a bill here in a bipartisan manner. If there was ever a bipartisan bill, this was it. It was signed by President Bush. And he had publicly said, should this bill come before him, he would be glad to sign it, and he did in 2008. This was a bill that affects every human being because each one of us is decided by scientists to have between 20 and 40 defective genes in our body. This bill simply protected that information so that you wouldn't lose your job or your health insurance because of your genetic makeup, because the fact you had the gene did not mean you were going to get the condition. And if you did, it could be 30 or 40 years down the road, and discrimination was happening every day. And we thought it was the rankest kind of discrimination. Even the government had discriminated at Livermore Labs, and it took Congresswoman Biggert and I worked many, many years on getting this done. America's not going to be benefited at all if we do away with this piece of legislation. As a matter of fact, that whole scientific field will be set back. And just in the last 2 weeks, I've read in a couple of publications that genetics is just now coming into its own by being able, in one case, to cure blindness that was caused in infancy. We would hope that no babies would get that, but that by putting the correct gene behind the retina, they could restore eyesight. You don't want to do away with that. But I don't know how many examples in this bill would affect the American citizens and probably the rest of the world in research. But that doesn't make any sense at all. And frankly, I would hope that nobody here would intend that that bill could be stopped. Actually, 14 years, awful long time to work on one. Large that because so many people thought we were talking about cloning and couldn't get beyond that. That, of course, was not the case. We had the best. I can't, but it's part of the fact that HHS had not promulgated all the rules. I think in, let me tell you what section that is. No, it's all been, it's already in law except for this one piece they haven't done and would be a part of the review you would be doing to do away with. Title I, well, I don't think this bill is going to go to the Senate, so I must say I'm.
The question is, how fast will the Senate act? Your concern seems to be they couldn't get this rule done, their rule done before the Senate.
And believe you me, I have sent them my strongest feelings on that matter as to why they have not yet done that. There's no reason in the world for them not to have promulgated those regulations by now. I wouldn't think so, but I don't know. Well, apparently it is, because when I got to work this morning, I was told that this was a very serious concern, and we were going to do amendments to try to stop it. Well, you know, I'm not sure you could even put a price tag on what we're trying to do with this bill, and what we're going to do with research to make it so much better. How do you know, Mr. Issa, that you're not doing that throughout this entire bill?
Well, the whole point is that.
And not just the idea that you're saving jobs, and I don't see how.
Aren't for health and safety, aren't for civil rights, and cost over $100 million. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're making.
This may very well come under one of those headings. It must, or my office would not have been that concerned about it. The Rules Committee staff knows pretty much what it's doing.
Don't cost a lot of money.
I have no idea the cost.
We're trying to deal with the president having to look at and evaluate one's costing over $100 million. I hope you'd appreciate that every day the president is unaware of bills that cost over $100 million.
I don't know whether he is or not, and I don't think anybody else does. The fact is, what I want to say to my colleagues here, it's the last thing in the world that we want to do is to do away with pieces of legislation like this, which is vulnerable to whatever it is you're doing here. And I'm not altogether clear on it. Mr. Cummings? Yes.
Mr. Carter, I certainly understand what you're saying, and I think all of us need to be careful. You're talking about,
Absolutely.
For example, NIH, and with regard to genetics, if you talk
Right.
to the doctors there, they're making phenomenal strides with regard to cancer, so it may cost more than $100 million. And so we don't
and it'd
know.
be-
That's part of the problem. You have this blanket kind of
Yeah.
effort. You sweep up everything.
The important thing I want to tell you is that after the the gene BRCA1 was discovered, doctors were telling women who thought there was a lot of breast cancer in their family not to get the tests until this law was passed. It was that serious a matter. But the reason we're moving with such great strides now by leaps and bounds is because people will allow themselves to be used for research. They couldn't do it before this bill was passed. Please don't jeopardize anything as important to humanity as this
What I don't
is.
understand is, if it was signed under President Bush,
Mhm.
what's the president doing for 3 years?
Most of it has been done, and I wish I could fathom the mind of people over there who didn't get this all done, but there's one section that has not yet, the regulation has not been finished. We've made that pretty well known over there. I think they are aware of that today, because it only came to our attention this morning. We've made that clear. But while we're trying to deal with that over there, I hope to goodness this Congress will not pass something that would jeopardize that kind of research and that kind of promise for things that plague mankind.
I assume you're happy with Title IV, the unfunded mandate information transparency, which simply codifies executive orders, bipartisan executive orders. That part you're okay with.
Mr. Issa, I simply want to tell you that having spent 14 years to pass this bill, as important as it was, that we held up research in the United States of America for most of that time because people were afraid to be as part of research in genetics. And inasmuch as each of us has between 20 and 40 faulty genes, as I said before, that meant it affected every single one of us and everybody else we knew that was alive. Do not jeopardize that in the name of doing something really quick to create a job or something. Please do not do that. The jobs that can be created from the research that comes from this will far more than compensate anything that you're going to try to lose here.
Amendment to accept that would be ruled in order.
Mr. Chairman.
Good. Then because there is one, and I'm happy to hear that. Thank you very much. Mr. Griffin?
Yes, I just want to make it real clear because I'm sure that every member of this committee and every member of the Congress can find a law that they have great concern about. And I'm sure we will hear all those as it is debated on the floor. But what I will repeatedly point to are the exceptions. One exception in particular is so broad that anything, any regulation could be brought to Congress's attention by the President, and that is under the section entitled Congressional Waivers. And it says, for any significant regulatory action not eligible for one of the specific waivers listed above, the President may submit a written request to Congress for a waiver of the application of this section. The bottom line is, I don't think you have to worry. I certainly don't believe you do. And all the different things that we're going to hear about baby formula and what have you, this waiver is so broad that the President could send every single pending regulation to the Congress for review and approval. So I don't think I would worry about that. I know you're concerned about it, but there is an exception. Thank you.
But, Mr. Griffin, if I may ask you a question, do you feel as the author of the bill that you have gone over carefully enough that you're not causing that kind of harm?
Absolutely.
You feel that you haven't?
I am.
Then I'm very confused as to why this genetic discrimination bill
And if
was
the President
passed.
has to
Yes.
Because it
President
should
has to
not
send it to this Congress, I worry.
Well, I do not. In fact,
It won't go anywhere.
the provision of
I know
the
that.
the provision of the congressional waiver section reflects the same thought that was in the REINS Act that the House passed. You can agree or disagree with that bill, but the idea that this would somehow exclude this legislation you talk about, I'm happy to sit down with your staff if they'd like to and discuss it.
Well, I hope you all recognize the importance of not undoing this priceless research that
Yeah, well,
taken
Madam,
us so long. 14 years was a long time in a person's
Yeah,
life to try to pass a bill.
I guess
Yeah,
4
Madam
more
Rankin.
years with no regulation is a long time, too.
yeah, well, Madam Ranking Member, this legislation that you refer to would be stopped in its tracks. And it would be stopped in its tracks until the unemployment rate went to, or came down to 6%, which is not projected to happen until the year 2016. 16. And so what we're doing when we have to have the president to exercise a loophole in the bill and then send it back to 435 members of the House of Representatives, along with another 100 members in the other chamber, we're pretty much locking in the fact that we're not going to have any regulations issued during that time. We just bog down the process, muck it up, and meanwhile, those who are making their money will proceed to do so with reckless abandon. That includes toys for babies. It includes Affordable Health Care Act regulations. It includes Dodd-Frank regulations that can keep our country from going back into a tailspin. And this bill is just a catch-all waste basket for regulations, good and bad.
Probably another one-house bill. Thank you.
Would the gentlewoman yield?
I will.
Politely, I'd like to disagree with some of the characterizations I've heard here, and perhaps we could agree that maybe this might fall within the business purview of rules and regulations. But I would strenuously object that we are miles apart on children safety and issues that deal with seniors and children. I have spent a lot of time working with Democratic members throughout the years, including Henry Waxman, Senator Kennedy, Chris Van Hollen, a number of people. There is a content of Republican thought process that I believe quickly got thrown to the gutter. I'm just saying, quickly. And I would like to say that I would be one to say it's not okay. We can perhaps find common agreement maybe in the business area, but not in the safety.
Let me reclaim my time.
I would appreciate that.
Obviously, you didn't listen to me.
I did listen to every word, and that's the
As
problem.
I pointed out, this was a bipartisan bill. Republican committee chairs were co-sponsors on this bill. It was signed by President George W. Bush, and Judy Biggert worked with me side by side on this for years. I have in no way cast any aspersions.
Well, there have been a number of things said in this hearing that,
What about cloning?
no, I'm
That
just
was
saying about
serious
children's health, about things. And all I would suggest to you is perhaps we could say whatever one would choose to say about business, but not about the health or safety of children or seniors. And I just take proper objection to that, because I am active on a regular basis, on a bipartisan basis,
We all are.
and you know that.
Well, Congressman, you're
I'm now going to call on Ms. Fox, who is
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support my colleague from Dallas in saying that Republicans believe in laws. We believe in regulations. And to have sweeping comments made impugning us, our motives, and implying that we don't care about the health and safety of American citizens is totally improper. We do care about the health and safety of American citizens. And I think if you look over the years, you will see that Republicans have been as responsible for good things happening in this country to American citizens as our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And I do think some of the comments here today have impugned our motives. And I think if this were on the floor, the parliamentarians would probably call attention to those comments and urge people not to do that. In terms of, again, our wanting no regulations as opposed to good regulations. That's what we want, good regulations. And for somebody to say that we have a myopic focus on cost is, again, to imply that all we care about is money. Certainly we care about money, but we care more about the overall health and safety of the people in this country. And just because we talk about not wanting to impose huge costs on the business community doesn't mean that that's an invitation to do things that are wrong. That's not at all where we're coming from. And who's to know, again, if we slow down the spending on unnecessary rules and regulations, that money isn't going to be used to do even better things. That's where we're coming from. And there are ridiculous rules and regulations out there that waste the money of hard-working American taxpayers. And that's what we want to stop, and allow that money to be used for the creation of jobs or perhaps to fund research. You know,
Will the gentlelady yield?
No, sir, I won't yield. I want to finish my comments. I think it's important that we make the distinction that often needs to be made in this committee as well as on the floor. There seems to be an attitude, and again, I'm not going to do what I've accused other people of doing, but there seems to be an attitude on the part of some of our colleagues that all the money that is generated by our hardworking citizens belongs to the government and not to those people. So I think it's really important. The other thing I'd like to say is, it's been pointed out, I believe, by Mr. Griffin and Mr. Issa both, that there are pieces of this legislation that have been recommended by President Clinton and President Obama. And I hardly think that their focus is one that's a myopic one on cost. Even they understand that in some cases the bureaucrats have gone over the line with regulations. So I think that this is bipartisan. Most of the legislation in here is bipartisan. I think people on both sides of the aisle, people not only in the Congress, but in the executive branch, have recognized that some people have overreached in this area, and perhaps it's time for us not to stop regulations. And I think Mr. Griffin pointed out a really good piece in the legislation that's wide open. If there's a need, the regulations can be developed. The last thing I would say is I believe the Constitution means something. I believe the fact that it starts out with the legislative branch and that it starts out with the House of Representatives means a lot. And I believe that we've abrogated our responsibilities in the last few years to the executive branch. And I think it's long past time for us to bring back into the House our responsibilities for oversight on what happens to the legislation that we pass, and that we not turn all the responsibility for the implementation of that legislation over to the executive branch. And so I welcome this legislation. I happen to have a bill as a part of the legislation that I want to give lots of credit to Brandon Renz for, and to my colleague from Oklahoma, who's here, who has helped me tremendously, Mr. Langford. I'm going to give them credit when I speak about the legislation on the floor, but I want to say something to them, and I want to thank Chairman Issa for allowing my bill to go through the committee structure.
Would the gentlelady yield?
To that point, I think you made the most important point about the essential part of this bill, whether it's Title II, the Midnight Rule Relief Act, that stops future presidents from, during that 75 days in which they could be a lame duck, from making rules, something that is believed to have and has been studied by GAO to have been abused under both Republican and Democratic administrations. And secondly, the one that I think you said very well, Ms. Fox, there is nothing in any of this regulatory relief that would stop the administration from beginning a rule process, determining that it's over $100 million and does not fall under any of the exceptions, having a public comment, and then bringing it for legislative authority. Ultimately, if a rule should be written, then Congress should, quite frankly, be very supportive. And I know Ms. Slaughter was concerned, but there would be nothing to stop Secretary Sebelius from, when the rule was ready, if for some reason it was not excluded or able to be accepted by any other under $100 million or health and safety, it could be brought to the Congress, and it would be very bipartisan, just as the original law is. I believe, and I think one of the points is, that if, in fact, every regulation was brought to the Congress as part of a package, we would pass virtually every one of them. And the reason is they would make good regulations, well thought out ones that were in the spirit and the law, the spirit and the letter of the laws we passed. So I think you hit the most important thing, Ms. Fox. We are simply taking back our responsibility. We're not taking away the President's actual responsibilities, but we're saying when it's expensive or when you're in a lame duck situation for those 75 days, come to Congress if it doesn't fall under any of those major exclusions, of which there are a great many.
Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Griffin wanted to say something, and Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, I spoke with Chairman Dreyer when I arrived here. I am supposed to manage the floor in about 5 minutes. I would ask permission if I could leave in about 5 minutes.
Let's, if we could, suspend your questions
Certainly.
for just a minute and see if Mr. Hastings or Mr. Polis have a question of Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a question of Mr. Griffin, and take full cognizance.
Gentleman may proceed.
I take full cognizance of the fact that he has to go to the floor.
Elsie, is your mic on? I can't hear you.
I'm not sure. I heard. Can you hear me now?
A little better.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, firstly, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place into the record the statement of administration policy.
That objection.
And I would come back to that. But, Mr. Griffin, when 4778 was propounded, am I correct that it barred new regulations until the unemployment rate dropped to 6%?
That is correct. 6% is the unemployment rate in the bill.
Well, I certainly am not prescient, nor do I have any crystal ball, but it would seem to me then that what would happen is, under that provision, that the likelihood of certainly beyond 2016 coming and going for unemployment in this nation to be at 6%. Did you anticipate that, and is that what is meant? Because in essence, what will wind up happening is somewhere to just gut what new regulations might be required, even if passed under a Republican legislature.
I thank the gentleman for the question. I would say a couple things. First of all, 6% is the upper end of what economists define as full employment. But I would say more broadly, this bill's general posture is much like that of the REINS Act, where you're not freezing regulation without exception. You are freezing it, but you provide exceptions for regulations to be approved by Congress, or there are exceptions for health and safety, criminal, necessary to enforce criminal civil rights, et cetera. So there are mechanisms in it, but it would require Congress to have a role.
Right. I can appreciate that, but I shudder to think what would happen if determining good or bad, our regulations were left to totally the devices that we employ. The administration says it's committed to ensuring that regulations are smart and effective, and that they're tailored to advance statutory goals in the most cost-effective and efficient manner, and that they minimize uncertainty. Agreeing with many provisions set forth in the Statement of Administration Policy, what really bothers me about the fact that we are even here at this hour is that it's yet another useless exercise. I don't know. I don't question your being the scrivener of this provision and having done an admirable job, but it came out of judiciary 21-16, and then here we are, the Congress that was going to take up each measure individually, cobbling 6 different provisions under this measure to count 7, and somehow or another that just simply does not compute with me, other than just plain old unadulterated politics. And if that's what you all are about, then you're wasting my time and the time of our colleagues by bringing forth something that clearly is not going to become the law, without getting into the substantive aspects of saying. But I would put to you every day there are regulatory requirements that have helped people in this country. We just learned in Florida, my colleagues may or may not have, from Florida, may or may not have seen the report, that 7 out of 10 offers of fish on menus are not the fish that they say it is supposed to be. I shudder to think if we didn't have regulatory responsibilities, what would happen. But my big beef is with water, and your attitudes with reference to it seem to be troubling. I think potable fresh water is perhaps the key to all of our health, and I would hope that we have all of the exacting regulations. One final statement, Mr. Chairman.
If I could respond, it sounds like you're accusing me of not liking clean water.
No.
Well, if you could explain, I would appreciate it.
On the contrary, I was talking about overall, if regulations are, and I accept what you say about the exception, where the president would have an opportunity. But this is a clear shot at the Obama administration, and that's what it boils down to. If we had a midnight rule, or as Title II suggests, then what would happen if we were to have a change in administration? You'd be right back here talking about changing the midnight rule. And I guess it will be the 1 a.m. rule or something else. But no, I offer no accusations. I just offer experience based on what has happened in the past. We attacked the Environmental Protection Agency with the thought in mind that they are going to be harmful to business. If they're so harmful, if all of these agencies that propound these regulations are so harmful, how in the world is Wall Street, other than their little 100-point dip today, doing so great? How is it all these businesses are managing to flourish and have trillions of dollars set over on the side? I gather that we'll get to some of those kinds of things, but this is, in the final analysis, a useless exercise. Thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will go ahead and thank the gentleman. He yields back his time. Mr. Woodall, do you have a question for the gentleman? Okay, Mr. Polis, do you have a question for the gentleman?
Yes, thank you. I just want to add briefly again, I think this is really a missed opportunity. I had the opportunity to sit on judiciary as major components of this were being passed, and I think there's the opportunity for common ground. Certainly, many Democrats care deeply about cutting red tape, unnecessary government regulation, improving response times. But instead, there were many Democratic ideas that were shot down on party line votes, and I would love to find a way to work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on pragmatic steps to move forward that the President will sign off on and that the Senate will sign off on that can cut response times, reduce red tape, help remove unnecessary regulations on businesses. But this approach is not the approach to do it. I yield back.
Thanks, Joan. Yields back. Mr. Nugent? Okay, Mr. Scott, Ms. Webster. The gentleman is excused, and I thank you for being here.
Thank you, sir.
We will now go back to the gentleman, Mrs. Fox, and her time.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Johnson had a comment that he wanted to make, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. It was not my intent to impugn anyone's motives or to say that there's a single-minded, myopic focus. I think it was my intent to say that on cost. It certainly was my intent to say that, but I did not mean it offensively. And but that's the only reason given for the legislation. For the, it's the cost of the legislation. And as far as I know that there have been years where my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have acted as statesmen and stateswomen. And I quite frankly feel that we don't have enough of that going on today. That would be the thing that would keep any regulations that the President saw fit to exercise a loophole to send back to Congress. That is the reason why Congress would not be able to address those issues, because Congress, as it stands today, is a gridlocked, broken institution. And, parties have pledged not to work for consensus, not to negotiate. Negotiate is a bad word. Compromise is a terrible word. And it is a terrible practice, and it is not done up here. And so to think that we would be able to have meaningful regulations coming out of this House or the Senate that's just untrue. That's a fantasy. So what we're going to have is a world free of regulations that protect men and women and babies and old folks from all kinds of dangers that the profit-driven interests don't seem to be cognizant of. I'll put it lightly like that, or just simply ignore. And because the deal is to achieve the short-term profits quarterly, and we'll do everything we have to do in order to attain that goal. And to the extent that we have government regulations getting in the way, we want to get rid of them. So I do respectfully assert that costs is one of the is probably the fundamental basis for this legislation. And I'd yield back. I don't know if
Ms. Fox, perhaps I could clarify. I know the gentleman keeps saying cost, but as one of the authors of this legislation, yourself and my committee, it's about jobs. The cost to business is a cost to competition. It's a cost to the ability to be able to compete around the world. When the cost of Boeing goes up, Airbus wins. When the cost to producing steel occurs, we import. So I would hope that the gentleman would understand that when maybe he says cost and he means money. When we say cost, we mean American jobs. And that's why the title of this bill is the Jobs Act, Job Creation Act. It's the reason that we, in fact, want to make sure that regulations are slowed down and more carefully considered, particularly those that have a cost in dollars, but also a cost in jobs to the American people.
Well, I would challenge my colleague to point to any kind of studies that would prove that regulations stop businesses from creating jobs.
With that, I would ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Oversight's Regulatory Implementation Job Creations study be placed in the record. Includes direct quotes by the President's representatives that assert to just that, including Mr. Sondheim.
Without objection.
Just for a clarification on that report, that's a report that was prepared by the Republican side of the Oversight Committee.
I I would ask the gentleman is...
I just wanted that clarified, and it was released, by the way, and leaked to the press before one member of the Democratic side even saw it. So
Is that designated as such, Mr. Chairman?
The staff report is designated as such, and the minority has the ability to produce their own.
I just wanted to make it clear, I don't need a document put on the record that Democrats had absolutely nothing to do with, that they wrote about in the newspaper, and not put in. And
As long as it's designated as clearly delineated that way, I will go ahead and allow that.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I have one more brief comment. Since the gentleman from Georgia issued a challenge, I would respond, and I'm not asking him to comment now, but I would like you, if you would at some other time, to show me and others here where you have learned that our party has pledged no compromise, no negotiation. I've never seen that written, and...
I've heard it spoken.
Well, I've never seen it written, I've never seen it spoken. And if the gentleman can produce such evidence, I'd like to see it. And with that, I yield back.
There was a TV interview with Barbara Walters shortly before the start of this 112th Congress. Speaker Boehner refused
Mr.
to
Chairman,
use the word
I don't need that
compromise.
now. I don't need it now.
Gentleman's recognized.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, Speaker Boehner refused to use the term compromise. He wouldn't even say it. And then there have been numerous others since that time who have indicated that compromise, I believe that compromise is a bad word in the 112th among my colleagues on the Republican side, as evidenced by even Senator McConnell on the other side, saying that, you know, his job is to make sure that President Obama is a one-term president. And since that time, I've seen no evidence of any desire to compromise.
I appreciate the gentleman.
Brinksmanship has been the name of the
forthrightly
game.
responding to support his contention, and I do appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
With that said, I believe both members here are speaking directly to each other, and in the benefit of both speaking to each other, you've been given a chance and she's been given a chance. I think her request would still be there, and so for whatever purpose you're able to do that as colleagues to help us to continue moving forth with this legislation, I appreciate that very much in the spirit of fairness to both members.
Are we questioned out?
Perhaps we are. We're going to ask if any other member has a question for the remaining panel. And, yeah, gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I'm sorry my friend Mr. Griffin had to go. He's one of the first members I met up here. He and his wife were here. He's talking about a 6-month-old child at the time and what his dreams were for his son and for their family. And to you, Mr. Cummings, I would just ask, because I listened to your presentation carefully, do you believe that when that regulation for the protection of infant formula comes back to Capitol Hill from the administration, this regulation that speaks to the health of Tim's children, all of our children and grandchildren, that we wouldn't be able to find 218 votes in this House to pass it, that for partisan reasons? Or
I would hope and pray, and I really mean that, I would hope and pray that it would. And what I'm saying is that if we can avoid that having to happen, one of the problems when and this is my point, we hear about bureaucracy all the time. People say, please, no more democracy. That adds to government. You know, that's going to be offending our government employees, by the way, having to go through all of this. And, you know, I think that I would hope that would be the case. I honestly don't know what would happen. And I think that there would be numerous situations of things that would have to be made an exception or exemption to this So I just don't know where it falls. And then we know that as simple as some concepts are, if somebody was just looking at them and say, oh, that's a no-brainer, the next thing you know, we've got problems trying to resolve the minute issues and trying to get things together. I would hope so. And I would say to Mr. Sessions and to Ms. Fox and to you and to all of us, we, I often say, we have to remember what we're for, not who we're against. And I do believe that we're for, all of us are for making sure the health, welfare, and the safety of each one of our constituents is protected. But when you look at something like the Dodd-Frank Act, you would think that there would be phenomenal agreement when the country almost went down the drain. But there was a lot of disagreement, And I'm not saying one side is right, one side is wrong. But somebody could sit back and say, there should be no problem.
You make exactly the right point, Mr. Cummings. I was just talking to some of my community bankers over the weekend. We closed 2 more banks in Georgia.
As a matter of fact, we had a banker before one of our subcommittees the other day, and I said to him, I understand exactly, because some of the people in my district are going to the same problems, can't get loans or whatever, and we talked about one word that is such an important word. It's a simple word, and it's called balance. You got to balance all of this out. And I told him that I understood this problem, and that there was a broad sweep when we tried to regulate. And you got the regulators putting the bankers, and the bankers putting the regulators, and unfortunately some folk have gotten caught up. Why? Because people cheated. People lied and got us into this predicament. So sometimes there are consequences, and until they get it right. And one of the things I also said to you, Mr. Will, we hear the quotes of President Obama, and a lot of those quotes, I think we need to also give him credit. We talk about black nations not moving fast enough. Part of that is probably an intentional effort to make sure they get it right. To make sure, and a lot of people forget, a lot of the regulations that we're talking about didn't come from the Obama administration.
To your point exactly, though, you accurately talk about balance, you accurately talk about getting it right. I think it was Chairman Issa who said that with this provision in place, he would expect any administration to work a little bit harder, to work a little bit better. I mean, would you characterize the Dodd-Frank regulations that continue to come out of the administration as capturing that proper balance that you're looking for?
You know what? I don't know. You'll have Barney Frank up in a minute, or people from that committee. But I think that they have tried to look at a problem that almost, in the words of President Bush, almost took us over a cliff. President Bush said this when he came to us, begging for us to do something. And in a bipartisan way, we tried to do something to help. These problems are very complex. And I think, I don't question the motives of members of Congress. I do believe that those who voted to do what President Bush asked us to do were acting in what they believed to be the right things. Others who didn't, that was what they believed to be the right thing. And I would hope that, again, things seem simple, but they're not that simple. But I appreciate your comments.
Well, my neighbor from Metro Atlanta called for more statesmen in this institution, and I have to tell you, as an 18-month member, I do not see the world that you see that believes that we would not find those 218 votes. I can't imagine not finding those 218. I made a list from creating jobs, to protecting infant formula, to allowing updates to Medicare payments, to protecting child safety, to protecting generic privacy, to saving the eyesight of a child, and on and on. I cannot imagine the circumstance where either administration, a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, sends those regulations back to Capitol Hill. And I come from one of the most conservative districts in all the land. And I can't imagine that vote going down if an administration works hard to capture the intent of Congress and produce that fair and balanced regulation that you talk about. And so it's no wonder we're seeing the kind of disagreement over this bill that we are. And I hope that we will find some of those statesmen, Mr. Johnson, not just to speak out for building consensus, but to speak out for believing that folks on the other side of the aisle really do have the same goal, even if we have different ways of getting there. Mr. Chairman?
The ranking member mentioned when that community banker from Oklahoma came before our committee, he told us the story of one example of where bureaucrats make a rule that wouldn't be made if the light of day were shining a little brighter. Every single teller and every single behind-the-scenes processor, even if that processor is running a computer program and not working on a loan, has to qualify now as a loan officer because of the way the rule was written. Now, where do they go to get that undone? Had this rule been proposed and they've been able to go to the members of Congress, this rule certainly would have, under Dodd-Frank, covered, because it was mandated, that loan officers get fingerprinted and a number of things go on. But not every clerk and not everyone who happens to have a piece of paper get entered on a computer. It wasn't the intent of the legislation that was passed by the Congress, and the ranking member and I served on the conference committee for it. It wasn't the intent, and yet that's what he's facing. It doesn't add one thing for the consumer protection, but it adds cost to a very small community bank that is seeing over $1 million in new regulations in a bank that's only less than $200 million. It's very hard to be a community bank if you try to add that kind of cost. So it was probably not one that would have scored $100 million, but it certainly scored a lot of money to him, times a lot of community banks.
You know, sometimes it's only crisis that gets you to focus on things. My colleague from Florida asked Mr. Griffin if he would support this same thing, even in the absence of 6% unemployment. I hadn't thought about that, but the truth is, yes, I think as a believer in Article 1, I kind of value getting a second look at what either administration decides to do to see if it still comports with what Congress thinks it was supposed to be doing. But the crisis of unemployment and the jobs that hang in the balance bring that to us. But I hope we'll come to that point where we believe that once a decision is made here, that we would come together again to back up that decision with regulation.
Well, you know, and Title II doesn't expire when we get below 6% unemployment. Title II is about the 75 days in which a president, it can happen no more than once every 8 years, finds him or herself soon to be out of a job. It prohibits a major new rule not previously proposed and under consideration from being rushed through post-election. And it's really a very narrow restriction, but it goes to the idea that you would offer something in a rule that hadn't been talked about before the election and pass it before you leave town. It's a very small amount of time. It's a very rare occurrence, but it's one that I think, Mr. Hastings, we would not, if this passes and is signed into law, we would not take this one back ever under any administration. That 75 days is a day in which the administration is a caretaker for the next administration. And I think if you look at Title II carefully, you'll see it's not about President Obama. It's about major pieces of regulation not yet proposed before the election being brought in at the end. And it still has the carve-out exceptions for national security, enforcement of civil and criminal rights, and imminent threat to health. So it is narrow. It's one that I personally believe strongly needs to be signed by, if not this president, the next.
Well, and I would say that to you, Mr. Chairman. It is my great hope that this bill is signed by this president. But if it's not, it would also be my great hope that you would be back here again in a new Congress in whatever the next administration is, seeking to have that happen one more time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further request for a discussion with this panel? I see none at this time. I want to thank each of you for being here and excuse this first panel. The second panel that I would like to call up this time would include the gentleman, Mr. Markey, Mr. Hasty, Mr. Frank, and Mr. Manzullo. If they could please come before the committee. And, of course, without objection, any written statement that you have that would further your cause before this committee. Is the gentleman, Mr. Frank, still here? We'll see if he's out in the hall, and I would ask that he be allowed, upon him coming back, we would also include his testimony that he had prepared without objection will be entered to the record. Gentleman, Mr. Markey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hastings and I are actually here on two separate bills. The one that you are considering right now as an extension of the last panel, and a bill that deals with drilling in the...
Well, it was my understanding that you were here with discussion about the, I'm sorry. Okay, the committee did, and the chairman, who is not present this time, did understand that both discussions would take place at this time. So if you would delineate, okay, good. Is that your understanding, Mr. Hastings?
My understanding is I'm here for H.R. 6082.
All right, 6082.
Yeah, I mean, there's...
Then would be about the congressional replacement President Obama's energy restricting job limiting offshore drilling plan.
Right.
So it would be my understanding with that agreement then, evidently that's been under. Then the gentleman would be allowed to testify. If you would please delineate at the time that you give the testimony, Mr. Markey, and the same with Chairman Hastings.
So
gentleman may proceed.
Proceed. Good. Well, I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate your holding this hearing. I was especially glad I got here earlier and I saw Mrs. Slaughter walk in. I wish she's not here now. And I was kidding with her. It's dancing in the street, I think, next week, and a marathon the week after. She's moving very good. So, the congressional replacement of President Obama's energy restricting and job limiting offshore drilling plan is the substance of H.R. 6082. Under Section 18 of the Outer Continental Shelf Leasing Act, when any president, proposes a new 5-year offshore leasing plan, it must be submitted to Congress for a mandatory 60-day review before it goes into effect. On June 28th, President Obama's proposed 2012-2017 drilling plan was submitted to Congress, thereby starting a 60-day review clock. H.R. 6082 would replace the lease schedule in the President's plan with a more responsible, robust plan that safely opens new offshore areas known to contain the most oil and natural gas resources. There are stark differences between these two plans. For example, the President's plan closes 85% of our offshore areas to drilling and opens no new areas. It effectively reimposes the drilling moratorium that was in place up until 2008. However, H.R. 6082 opens new areas to drilling and specifically targets areas with the most oil and natural gas resources like the Mid-Atlantic, Alaska, and Southern California. The President's plan includes 15 lease sales, which is the lowest number offered since the process began in 1980. The 6082 plan includes 29 lease sales, nearly double. The President's plan will send American jobs overseas and continue our dependence on foreign oil. H.R. 6082 will foster new American job creation and increase our national and economic security. I believe that Congress has a responsibility to act. We can do better than the President's plan, and we should move forward with a real pro-energy, pro-jobs, offshore drilling plan. So I appreciate your taking allowing me to take the time, and I will yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Markey?
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
very much.
Yes,
I am here to testify both on H.R. 4078, the regulatory freeze bill, and H.R. 6082, the natural resources drilling package, which is before the committee. On the drilling package, I oppose that package. Obviously, we think it's a mistake to drill off the coast of Massachusetts, which this bill would make possible. Drill off the coast of Maine, New Hampshire. None of these states want it. None. Drill off the coast of New York, of New Jersey. None of these states want it. Drill off of the coast of Southern California. None of these states want it at all. You'll have millions of people on the beaches of these states just protesting, that they're going to turn Georgia's bank into ExxonMobil's bank. It would cause a revolution, because of the tourism, because of the fishing industries that are so central. And so I just wanted to let you know that there's just real opposition to this natural resources bill, although I understand that ExxonMobil and Shell and BP would like to get their hands on our beaches. This is really a fight that we think is worth having. So we oppose that bill, and I also oppose the regulatory freeze bill. And I can be brief here. I'll just say that I make a request that that my amendment be put in order, that if they find natural gas off of the shore of Massachusetts or Maine or New York, that they can't export that natural gas to some other country. So my amendment just says that the natural gas should stay here in America. If you're going to take such a huge risk with the fishing and the tourism businesses of these states, that the natural gas should then come on shore, not just be put on a ship and sent to another country. So that's the first amendment that I would ask to be put in place. The second is that the recommendations of the BP Spill Commission be put in place before you start drilling off of these beaches, before you start drilling in these sacred fishing areas, that we actually implement the BP spill recommendations. And on the regulatory freeze bill, my recommendation is that it exempt the CFTC rulemaking that will stop or put the cops on the beat to stop speculation in this commodities futures casino that was created and still exists in oil futures, that the policemen are put on the beat, that we just don't stop that from taking place, and that it exempts any rule dealing with health privacy. You know, our privacy, the health of each American, it's sacred, and we should be able to protect it when it comes to any family member's health information. That should just be exempted from this bill. So I ask that that be put in place. I don't even think we have to debate that. We can decide that right now. We don't have to wait for, a year, 2 years, 3 years for a request to compromise it. We should just decide right now. We're not going to see, some child's anorexia record just become a commodity that gets sold, or somebody's, genetic makeup is a product to be sold. Their privacy can be compromised, as Ms. Slaughter pointed to. So that would be the point. And I have some other amendments which I've requested to be put in order, but I can stop right there, and I thank the committee for its consideration.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Manzullo.
Thank you. I have an amendment to H.R. 4078. The amendment is co-sponsored by Mr. McIntyre of North Carolina and myself.
Excuse me, Mr. Frank, please feel free to join this panel. Thank you very much, sir. Well, we're delighted that you're here, and I noticed also, sir, that you had been waiting for quite some time and recognized that we would hold this place for you. Gentleman is recognized, Mr. Manzullo.
Thank you. The President announced a new policy on scientific integrity. Back then, I liked most of the language that was included in the new policy. The problem is that this was announced more than 3 years ago. We're still waiting implementation of it. The problem is that the policy that was announced has no teeth because it gives no one any way to require agencies to follow their own scientific integrity guidelines. The problem is that the nature of the federal regulation has been changing, with more and more major decisions being made without developing formal, final agency actions. Instead, we see more and more policy changes being made through the issuance of, quote, guidelines or the development of agency listings. At the time of the release of the initial memorandum, the President was focusing on preventing the politicization of science that he believed occurred during the previous administration. And yet now the current administration sometimes overrules the advice of in-house science experts or overlooks peer-reviewed science outside of government. These agencies will tell affected private parties that these guidelines or listings are not really regulations because they are not final actions. But the impact in the marketplace can be pretty final. For example, many here know of my strong concern with the listing of styrene as a possible carcinogen by the National Toxicology Program in the Department of Health and Human Sciences. The listing has had a multi-million-dollar impact on the styrene manufacturers across the country. Styrene is a chemical that's used in about 90% of all plastics, including plastic spoons and other utensils and product packaging. But HHS will say that their listing of styrene is not a final agency action, and therefore the Administration Review Act does not kick in. It's just an opinion that hangs out there and does all kinds of damage. There's no transparency, no formal procedure in the Administrative Procedure Act. They did not provide adequate opportunities for private entities. They ignored certain scientific studies, came to a different conclusion than other regulators around the world, such as Canada and EU, that have ruled quite to the contrary on styrenes. The plastic industry is the third largest manufacturing sector of this country. This so-called guideline or non-final action by the Bureau of Toxicology could end up in the loss of over 800,000 jobs. It's massive. And so what we're trying to do here is to engage this issue of a ruling that's not a final action and apply some type of guidelines to it. The President will use the Office of Science and Technology policy to develop recommendations to increase scientific integrity. So the whole purpose of this amendment is to place sound science at every level of the review, including those reviews that have not come to the point of being issued, quote, as a final regulation.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frank?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'm trying to find out, I guess I have to ask the bill sponsors, whether if the bill were to become law very soon, it would affect pending rule proceedings. We have a number of proceedings going on. People throughout the economy, including the financial industry, have asked that they be expedited in some ways. And I believe that most Americans are more critical of the fact that some of these rules haven't been adopted than they will be, whether it's some of the rules governing derivatives, which had previously been unregulated, whether it's the Volcker rule, a number of other rules that are in various stages of comment. And if they were to be shut off by this, it would be very chaotic. Beyond that, there are a couple of areas that I want to specifically exempt if we were going to do the bill. I of course, wouldn't vote for the bill as drafted under any circumstances. One, things come up that you can't always anticipate. We have learned, to my dismay, that some of the major financial institutions in the world were consciously lying to promote their own financial advantage with regard to the London interbank offered rate, the LIBOR. Indeed, I was a little chagrined to remember at one previous meeting up here, I was asked about, well, are there any neutral things we can go on as we look at the financial world? And I remember citing LIBOR, and now I learned, well, I was citing a fraud. And having learned that, and I don't think a lot of us were aware of how deeply deceptive and consciously deceptive these practices were, I don't believe we should be preempted from enacting it. Now, I know it says, well, if it's going to cost $100 million, well, some of these rules depends on how you define the economy. In the short term, some of these rules will cost some of these financial institutions money. We just saw Capital One penalized by the Consumer Bureau. It cost Capital One well over $100 million because they had to give it back to consumers. Interfering with the validity of LIBOR and its integrity, I assume that makes some money for people. That's one of the reasons they did it. They did it to game their derivative trades. I don't want us to be restricted in going after that. And then two others that I have. We have general financial problems, but we have a couple of groups that are especially vulnerable. The elderly, we know, older people who have some money and haven't been sophisticated. So I would hope that we would, if we were to do this, and again, I hope we don't do it, not say that if the Consumer Bureau stepped in to protect the elderly, that they wouldn't be able to do that. If there's recently been a proposal to do some new rules with regard to reverse mortgages. I think those do very well. We put in some safeguards, but I don't believe we've necessarily reached perfection. And similarly with veterans. I think these are groups that have been gamed by some people in the past, and so, as I said, I think the whole thing is grave error in the breadth in which it takes place. But if we were to do it, I haven't remembered, I would say that where we have a self-regulatory organization, LIBOR is not the only one. We have them in the futures, we have them in securities, that if we decide that self-regulation, frankly, is not working nearly as well as we had hoped because of the unwillingness of the self-regulators and the self-regulated, to be honest, I don't believe it would be a good idea for us to be retarded in dealing with that. And I don't think that we ought to say that if we want to protect the elderly, if some new scam comes up, that we shouldn't be able to do that.
Thank you very much to all four of you. We'll now begin the question. Mrs. Fox?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all of you all coming by. I have no questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hastings? Thank you very much, gentlemen. Yields back. Is there any other member of the committee that have a question for this panel?
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman is recognized, Mr. Woodall.
Mr. Hastings, thinking about what Mr. Markey said about drilling off the coast of Massachusetts, Maine, and New York and elsewhere, is it a mandate here that these leases must be sold? Is there a state option? What's the...
Well, understand how the process works. If you open up areas for lease, then the private sector will try to ascertain, based on the best information they have, whether there's any prospect there in order to buy a lease and explore. So the market somewhat has some ability to at least check on that. But understand that that the focus of this replacement bill is that any president's 5-year plan will offer leases based on the best information where the highest potential is. The highest potential, yes, there is a potential off the Atlantic coast, no question about it. There's probably a higher potential, however, in Southern California and in Alaska than there are there. But and the president then would make a determination on when and where to offer those lease sales. But it would be governed by somebody that obviously would bid on the lease sales. And why would somebody bid if they don't think there's any potential there?
And Mr. Markey, thinking about the amendments that you offered, what is that? When Mr. Cummings was testifying earlier, he said, I really feared that we couldn't get 218 votes to approve some of these regulations. What is that circumstance where we could get the 218 votes for your extreme weather, drought and flooding amendment, for example? We could get the votes to exempt those things from this bill, but we couldn't get the votes to approve the regulations relating to those things when they came out down the road. If we're reporting fair and balanced regulations, why can you win today but you couldn't win tomorrow?
Well, thank you for the question. The bottom line is that this bill is collecting every single regulatory process across every single, line of concern here, including, again, the privacy of health records. It's going to it's going to take away from the EPA the ability to be able to promulgate under the tailpipe regulation the increased fuel economy standards to kick out the 4.3 million barrels of oil per day that we import from the Middle East.
Let me reclaim my time just a moment because I might not have understood you.
Sure.
Does it take away anything from the EPA? I thought the only thing that the EPA has is what we have given the EPA.
Exactly.
And then the only thing that this thing does is to confirm that the EPA did what we asked them to do. Is there more going on than just that?
Yeah, what you're doing here is you're loading up this bill with all kinds of really great regulations, important regulations, and using a few examples that you think are egregious abuses as a justification for blocking those regulations from going into effect. Then, bringing this whole thing then back here at some point in the future as huge debates on already settled law, almost relitigating everything that's already been fought here on the floor of Congress, built into the law and given as a mandate to these agencies. You're taking the whole thing and just turning it into a blunderbuss. So if this was a bill that said, if you've got a problem with this regulation, that one, good, let's have a debate out on the House floor right now. And if you have the votes to repeal it, repeal it. But you're not taking a small number, using them as what you believe to be egregious abuses, and you're going to knock down hundreds of regulations that do benefit the public that you would never have been able to do absent using a process like this that doesn't really allow for a full debate on the full range of impacts of this law.
I fear that I'm not going to have many more times to question you, Mr. Frank, as you prepare to leave us here. But you've seen a lot of administrations come and go in your tenure here. I take Mr. Markey's point that he would have preferred that this language be crafted differently, though there is a larger point about Article 1 and whether or not we have, from both parties, delegated to all administrations too much congressional power. As you prepare to leave us, what's your institutional answer to
It's
that?
obviously something I've thought about a lot. I don't think it is useful to debate that in constitutional terms. I think that the courts are there if what the administration does cannot be justified as within the delegation. I don't think the delegation issue makes sense. And here's the problem we have with trying to legislate more specifically, and I've thought about this. In the first place, in the area where I was most active recently, financial reform, things evolve. Two of the major things we addressed in the bill, we've had people say, well, why don't you just reinstate Glass-Steagall? Well, Glass and Steagall were very eminent men, Glass more eminent than Steagall, if you know the history. But they never heard of derivatives. They never heard of securitization. Had we simply reenacted Glass-Steagall, there would have been no regulation of derivatives or securitization, that is, making loans when you don't have to stand behind them. On the other hand, I didn't know anybody who could tell me how specifically we should do that. Securitization is new for us. We set on 5% risk retention, and you take the first 5%. That may not work out well. It may work out well. I don't want to have to go back and legislate, so that's why I think you need to give a certain discretion. And in some ways, it's an indication by us that we don't know quite as much. The other area is this, and people who've raised children know this. I don't have children, but I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and I have learned from them that the more specifically you tell your child not to do something, the more the child is likely creatively to do something close to that, which you wish she or he hadn't done. And I think if you get too specific, you also run into that problem. So it is a dilemma. You don't want to be too broad, but that is that's the nature of it.
To the gentleman's point, Mr. Chairman, I think we could end up with lots of $99 million regulations here, and I think there's an amendment that will lower that threshold to 50. So I hope you will.
And of course, that, if I might, well, that in itself would become a great source of litigation as to how much is it worth and what kind of figures you put into it about discounting it going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Other members of the panel of the committee have any questions for the panel? Seeing none, I want to thank all four of you for being here today and your excuse. Chairman recognizes that we are now right at 6:33.
Votes expected in just a few minutes. What I'd like to do is recognize we're going to do two panels so that we don't get 7 people up at one time. I would like to ask Mrs. Woolsey if she would come up, Mr. Watt, Mr. Posey, and Mr. Langford. If you would please each come to the table, and there will be 4 chairs. The Chairman does recognize that there are 3 other members that would wait for testimony, and I would ask those members to recognize that I do recognize their presence here before us. Without objection, any of the testimony that each of our members have at this time, without objection, your testimony, anything that you have written will be included within the record, and would first go to the gentlewoman, Mrs. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee, for being here. I have 2 amendments. You have copies of both of those amendments at the desk, so I'll shorten it. I think we might appreciate all that. Both of these of my amendments are asking for exceptions to the proposed H.R. 4078, the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act. And the first one, Mr. Chairman, is that I'm seeking to have made in order would exempt a proposed OSHA regulation from both the regulatory freeze and the midnight rule provisions contained in H.R. 4078. This regulation updates a 40-year-old rule. It's 40 years old, and it would update it so that it would reduce the number of fatalities and injuries associated with high-voltage transmission and distribution equipment. Power line workers face dangerous working conditions every day, no matter the health of this economy. They shouldn't have to wait for the unemployment rate to drop below 6%, nor should they be subject to the whims of the electoral calendar to gain protections as basic as flame retardant clothing. So my amendment would do one thing, and that would be to exempt that piece of legislation from the legislation. The second amendment I have would be to exempt the Family and Medical Leave Act for military family members from the Act. This provision was signed into law in 2009, and it provides up to 26 unpaid days leave to care for serious ill veterans or troops who became ill or were injured while on active duty. We're waiting for the DOD to issue the final rules, and it would seem that this new provision, this new law that you're talking about, cannot be across the board, because by issuing regulations that would hurt the very Americans who have earned our admiration, our respect and support, it would be to undermine our military families. And they are so excited that they have this possibility and they are part of FMLA, but nobody can tell them how and when. With
Thank you very
that,
much.
I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here to ask that you make in order several of my amendments, including one to keep the Treasury from implementing a rule and reversing a 100-year-old policy that has encouraged foreigners to put their money in U.S. banks. For nearly 100 years, we've told foreigners that the U.S. banks are a welcoming place for their deposits. But earlier this year, the IRS issued a rule imposing cumbersome reporting requirements that has already led to $300 million being withdrawn from U.S. banks, according to the Florida International Bankers Association. Billions more are soon to follow as the implementation deadline nears this year. We cannot afford to wait until the end of the year to act on this, because each day that we delay, deposits are leaving the U.S. for Singapore, Panama, the Bahamas, Cayman Islands, and elsewhere. And this money will not return to the United States, and it will not be put to work in our communities. The time to act is now, and I submitted amendments number 67 or 68 to the committee to address this issue. Number 67 is an outright ban on the implementation, and number 68 provides a delay until the Treasury completes an economic impact study of the proposal, which today they've refused to do despite bipartisan calls for them to do it. I've revised 68 and resubmitted it to the committee, and as revised, the amendment ensures that the rule cannot take effect until after unemployment falls below 6%, which is fully consistent with the underlying bill. I have copies of several bipartisan letters from House members to Treasury opposing this regulation. Let me note 3 members serve on this committee. Representatives Webster, Nugent, and Hastings signed the letter asking the Treasury to withdraw the regulation. These letters show strong opposition to this regulation from both parties. The letter was signed by every single member of the Florida delegation, Republican and Democrat. I'd ask the committee to make and order additional amendments subsequently. Mr. Chairman, you want me to go through all of them now, or just stop at that one?
As the gentleman would choose.
No, what do you have, lots of amendments here?
Just several.
Several is lots to me, but...
I think we have 4, Mr. Chairman.
Go right ahead, Bill.
Okay. I would ask the committee to make in order additional amendments I've offered that would rein in out-of-control regulators. Amendment number 54 would rein in regulators by stopping implementation of a rule if any part of the rule is found to have exceeded legislative authority of the regulator. that is to say the statutory authority to promulgate the rule. Today, regulators are casting too wide a net with little regard for how their overreach affects businesses, local and state governments, and individuals. This amendment would make sure that they are more judicious. Number 48 requires that damage payments made to compensate an agency that overreaches come from the office that overreached. This will encourage regulators to make sure that they are on solid ground before issuing regulations and holds their particular agency accountable when they do. Amendments number 49 and 53 would allow any party adversely affected or aggrieved by any rule or guidance resulting from a regulatory action to seek damages against any federal officer or employee who engaged in exceeding their regulatory authority. We need to understand that regulatory overreach amounts to stealing the livelihood and production of American citizens and business. An employee who steals something should not be protected by the government. There needs to be accountability for that, and my amendment simply brings that greater accountability. Federal employees and officers must work within their statutory authority and legislative intent. My final amendment, number 50, is modeled on legislation introduced by Senator Barrasso and me, and would simply keep the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission focused on protecting investors from fraud and abuse in the financial markets instead of pursuing global climate change policies. That's it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I understand we've heard from Ms. Woolsey, so I'm suffering here badly, having missed your testimony, so I feel horribly. I'll look forward to a copy of it. And have we heard from you two yet? Okay, well, Mr. Watt, you're the senior guy here, so proceed, and we will again enter into the record any prepared statement. We welcome a brief summary. We've got another panel coming. We've got votes going on downstairs, as you know, so please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On September 16, 2011, we passed an overwhelmingly bipartisan patent reform bill after working on it for years. Under that bill, a number of regulations were required to be put into effect, 20 in fact. At last count, 7 have been implemented, 9 have been noticed for under development, and this bill, we fear, would stop those regulations in their tracks. The most egregious one, just as an example, is the one that would allow a 75% discount on patent fees to micro enterprises, which could be the difference between whether a Microsoft becomes a Microsoft or Apple becomes an Apple. So we are asking simply for an exception to allow those regulations to go forward and be written. This was an overwhelmingly bipartisan bill, so I guess I'm here pleading for bipartisanship today.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Watt. We greatly appreciate it. Mr. Langford.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm coming to speak in support of Title IV of this bill. Virginia Fox was the original author of this from the previous Congress. The committee that I'm the subcommittee chairman on did 3 hearings on this, including testimony from Susan Dudley from the previous administration from OIRA, and Cass Sunstein, who's the President's OIRA director. In 1995, Congress put in the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act to give more information to Congress and how they make decisions and what they get a chance to look at before a bill is brought into being. This expands that and deals with the exceptions that were put in the 1995 to give Congress even more information. It also takes into account in the past, now 17 years since that was passed, the things that 2 previous Democrat presidents had put into place. Bill Clinton put in Executive Order 12866, which clarified and codified for the administration how they would handle the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. We want to be able to put that into law. And so we went through the hearings, heard great testimony, and got great feedback from this. This does allow us to have greater input, and it allows Congress to know what they're voting on when they deal with unfunded mandates of $100 million.
Thank you very much. It's very clear. I don't have any questions for any of the members of the panel. Any questions for these panelists here? Mr. Hastings? Which one? He had several. I called them lots. All of them? You support all of them? So you'll be running for anything that Bill Posey proposes. Okay, we'll just, okay, I just want to, am I extrapolating the wrong thing? Okay, sounds fair. Thank you all very much for being here. We greatly appreciate it. And before we get on for the vote, I think our final panel will consist of Messrs. Courtney and Schweikert. And I think that's it. Mr. Hastings, have you testified yet? Without objection, the statement of administration policy will be included in the record. Without objection, Mr. Hastings' statement will appear in the record as well. Thank you very much for your brevity there, Mr. Hastings. Gentlemen, Mr. Courtney, I think that you're probably the youngest, at least the way it appears here, but no senior of the two of you. So please proceed. Without objection, that beautifully prepared statement of yours will appear in the record in its entirety, and we welcome your summary, and then we'll go downstairs and vote, and then come back and report this rule out.
Chairman, the summary is very quickly to exempt the income-based repayment program. The Department of Education is issuing regulations which will cap interest or loan payments at 10%. Loan extension. A couple of weeks ago, President Obama signed into law with a bipartisan basis, and this is a program which is, I think, fully consistent with that bipartisan approach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courtney. Appreciate it, and without objection, that statement will appear in the record. Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee, and you're looking particularly fit today. Doesn't complimenting the chairman make it go faster?
No.
In many ways, this is actually a very... In many ways, this is a very simple amendment. It's on H.R. 4078. If you're working out the mechanics of what's the definition of the cost, okay, there's also the preparatory mechanics. We see this where regulations are being promulgated. What do you as an organization have to do now to, once the reg is issued, what's your cost? That, our fears in the clean reading of the language would not be properly added in. And so we're just trying to add an amendment that makes it clearer on here's how you define the costs of those regulations.
Good. Excellent. It's very clear. Any questions? Okay. No questions, Mr. Post? Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. That will conclude the hearing, and we hope that in the not-too-distant future, we hope at the beginning of the last vote to reconvene the Rules Committee and report out the rule. So, gentlemen, nice to see you all. Carry on bravely, and we'll see you back in a few minutes. Committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair. The Rules Committee will reconvene, and let me just say that we're here for further consideration of H.R. 4078 and H.R. 6082. And before we entertain a motion from our good friend from Grandfather Community, I'm happy to recognize the distinguished gentleman from Fort Lauderdale, Mr. Hastings. Without objection, the one statement from my California colleague, Ms. Richardson, and the two statements from our friend from Houston, Ms. Jackson Lee, will be included in the record. The chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentlewoman from Grandfather Community.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant H.R. 4078, the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act of 2012, a structured rule. The rule provides 2 hours of general debate equally divided among and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary and the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 112-28 as modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those further amendments to H.R. 4078 printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
You've heard the motion.
The rule,
oh, sorry.
The rule provides for consideration of H.R. 6082, the congressional replacement of President Obama's energy restricting and job limiting offshore drilling plan under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as original text for purpose of amendment, the amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 112-29 and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes in order only those amendments to H.R. 6082 printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit H.R. 6082 with or without instruction.
You've heard the motion of the gentlewoman from Grandfather Community. As I go through and look at the list of the 25 amendments made in order on the first bill and the 8 amendments on the second bill, 16 of the 25 are Democratic amendments and the others are either bipartisan or Republican amendments. I think that we've made too many Elsie Hastings amendments in order on this bill, and I wondered if as I look at the number of Hastings amendments, I was inclined to count the Doc Hastings one in here, but I guess I can't blame you for that one too, can I? Yeah. Well, as I said, I think you have more amendments to these two bills than you and Ed Markey. You and Ed Markey have the highest number of amendments, and on the second bill, every single one of the 8 amendments made in order have been offered by Democrats. And again, we weren't able to make every amendment in order, but 25 on the first, 8 on the second. I wished we could have made more in order. I was actually trying to get additional amendments made in order. But I think that this will allow for a free-flowing debate on the issue. I understand that there's opposition to this. Ms. Slaughter has clearly raised her concerns. I will say that I wasn't able to listen to all the testimony, but it's my sense that there is a desire to ensure that, as Ms. Fox said so eloquently when I was in the room, that doing everything possible to ensure that the safety, and Mr. Sessions raised this as well, the safety of children, obviously environmental issues, the rights of seniors are not in any way undermined with a threat to a structure that exists for them. And so I know there's a tendency to say that anyone who wants some more oversight on the issue of regulation, which is really what this is opposed to safety and security issues. And I hope that we're able to successfully disabuse people of that notion. So are there any amendments to the rule, Ms. Slaughter?
I do, Mr. Chair. And let me say at the beginning, I know you may hope for that, but given the extensive reach of this bill, I think probably the best hope we have is the Senate will not take it up, as expect they will not. I do have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee to grant H.R. 6082, H.R. 4078, each an open rule so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bills on the floor.
Thank you very much. Vote occurs on the Slaughter amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no.
Aye. Roll call, please.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions. Ms. Fox. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter.
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern. Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
And Mr. Clerk, the total?
3 yeas, 6 nays.
And the amendment is not agreed to. There further amendments? Ms.
Yes,
Slaughter.
Mr. Chairman. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for Ranking Member Markey's amendment number 71. I worked on the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act for 14 years to get it passed. Now the bill would take us backwards. The Markey Amendment protects the privacy of protected health information and prevents genetic discrimination. It deserves consideration by the full House.
Well, thank you very much. As I said, we have...
and let me also add, if I may, that Mr. Isis said while he was at the table that he had no objection to making this in order.
Good, thanks. Well, as you see, we've made 3 Markey amendments in order, and I'm going to urge a no vote. Those in favor of the Slaughter amendment will vote aye. Those opposed,
Aye.
no.
Aye.
The chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions. Ms. Fox. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter.
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern. Mr. Hastings.
Aye.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis.
Aye.
Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Mr. Clerk, the total?
3 yeas, 6
The
nays.
amendment's not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Yes,
Oh,
Mr.
Ms. Slaughter.
Chairman. I move the committee make an order, give the necessary waivers for the amendment by Representative Tonko. Number 1, which would require all companies who want these new leases to disclose their secret political campaign and super PAC contributions from the last 5 years.
Vote occurs on the Slaughter amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. And the chair,
Roll
the
call,
noes have it.
please.
And those- Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions. Ms. Fox. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter.
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern. Mr. Hastings.
Aye.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis.
Aye.
Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, the total?
3 yeas, 6 nays.
And the amendment's not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Chairman,
You want to withdraw
firstly,
some of your amendments? You want us to knock some of these out? That we
no, I told you I'd like to switch one that you did make in order with the one that I had hopes that you would make in order. That said, Mr. Chairman, I am grateful for the ones that you did make in order, as well as the amendment for Mr. Posey that I spoke to.
I think we have 3 of your amendments made. No?
Yes, and I appreciate that. I have an amendment to the rule, and I move that you make in order and give the necessary waivers for my 4th amendment that was not made in order, number 15, which will permit agencies to make regulatory actions intended to protect senior citizens' rights and benefits, including access to health care, food stamps, and other programs.
Thank you very much. The vote occurs in the Hastings amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed,
I ask
no.
for a recorded vote.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions. Ms. Fox. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter? Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern? Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, the total?
3 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment's not agreed to. Mr. Polis.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the following amendments: Cummings number 18, Frank number 29, Miller number 20, and Waxman number 34.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Mr. Chair, roll call vote.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions? Ms. Fox? No. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent? No. Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster? No. Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter? Aye. Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern? Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, the total?
3 yeas, 6 nays.
And the amendment is not agreed to. There are further amendments. If not, the vote occurs in the motion of the gentlewoman from Grand Public Committee. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Madam Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions? Ms. Fox? Aye. Ms. Fox, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Nugent? Aye. Mr. Nugent, aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, aye. Ms. Slaughter? No. Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern? Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Mr. Clerk, the total?
6 yeas,
And
3 nays.
And the motion is agreed to, and Ms. Fox will be managing for the majority. And Mr. Hastings for the minority. Thank you all very much, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Okay.